Hi, this is Pastor Steve, and I'm here to bring you some information on this Sunday for the Adult Forum, October 3rd, and I'm pleased to be with you. We're going to be looking at some wisdom literature that Pastor Blease has been introducing us to, and in particular the Book of Proverbs. Then we're going to watch from the Bible Project and get more information, but I'm going to share just a little prelude to you. Proverbs is the 20th book of the Old Testament. It is between Psalms and Ecclesiastes. I would go back and look at those 39 books and just review their order. But King Solomon is the one that has been credited as the author of the book of Proverbs. And the reason for this is because when you look at the three kings of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon, it was Solomon who asked God to give him wisdom so that he would be an outstanding leader of the Israelites. And so, as in the Bible Project today, King Solomon was looked upon as the fountainhead of Israel's wisdom. It actually says this in 1 Kings chapter 4. God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding, as vast as the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else. He composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He would speak of trees, from the cedar that is in the Lebanon area to the hyssop that grows in the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. As a matter of fact, people came from all the nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon. They came from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. There it is. The book probably carries wisdom from other cultures too, because wisdom literature was important in other cultures, Babylon and Egypt, and some of that probably trickled in along the way. We don't know for sure, but scholars have that suspicion. Now, the book does not mention Israel's history to any degree, so we don't go back to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai or any of those major events in Israel's history. This is just constrained to the wisdom literature, and a lot of these sayings are kind of short, pithy sayings, but they add up to help lead communities in the way of the Lord. So the other thing that's important is to know that this is not just head knowledge. It's intended to really change the way that people act and live together in communities. So you develop a set of skills and apply the knowledge in everyday living to your relationships and situations. Now, in the prologue, let me read from chapter 1, because this really comes down to reveal the purpose of the book. For learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity, to teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young. Let the wise also hear and gain in learning, and the discerning acquire skill, to understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. And then here's the kicker. It says in verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, fear is not meant to be necessarily terrified in God's presence, but rather to have a sense of awe and utter respect. It is a realization that God is God and we are human beings, and as we stand in relationship with God, we are humble. As a matter of fact, Martin Luther used to talk about this in the Small Catechism. He used that same phrase. We are to fear and love God so that we live according to the commandments. And I would encourage you to go back into the Small Catechism and see this, especially when Luther gives the meaning of the commandments from his perspective. In some regards, there's kind of a secular tone to some of these proverbs. And again, there is no guarantee here that when you have the distinction between the wise and the foolish, even though the wise might follow all of the instructions of this wisdom literature, the Proverbs, there's no guarantee that their life will go necessarily any better than a person who might be a fool. I mean, that seems so unfair, but it is the case that it's a guide to be followed, but again, there's no guarantee that it will always turn out as we hope, right? Now, that doesn't mean to dismiss them by any means, because you can see in the early days of this book that it was so important that the parents would use this in particular to pass along this wisdom to the children in the family so that they would lead a godly life and hopefully prosper. Now, when I was in seminary years ago, there was a professor named James Limburg, and he says this about the book of Proverbs. You might look upon it as a manual for conducting one's everyday affairs in a manner that is happy and successful in worldly affairs and also responsible before God. So this is a very important book for us to not skip over in the Old Testament. How do you read it? Well, here's a suggestion from Professor Limburg. He says, since there are 31 chapters in Proverbs, you could take a chapter a day and match the number of the day to the month, you see, and after that period of time have gone through the entire book. The short sayings, he says, should be taken individually, like a variety of expensive chocolates in a gift box. Every proverb might be like a sweet tasting chocolate and help you, right? And then he says some you might just skip over because they might have less influence on you. And so you can pass through those. But in a way, just see when you read the book, what grasps you in terms of something that is particularly connected to your life, okay? I think that it's fair to you to tell you that my favorite proverb is in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. And it goes like this: trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insights. In all your ways acknowledge him, and God will make straight your path. So I've gone through that memory work with that proverb for many years to ensure that I don't rely just on my own insights, as it says, but rather acknowledge God and ask God to make my life more on a straight path, and hopefully too for our congregation as we live together in this community. So why don't you be thinking, as we come into the Sunday Forum this week, about maybe a favorite proverb of yours. And if it's been beneficial to your own life, we'd like to share that in the community this Sunday at the Forum. So I look forward to seeing you then. And right now, let's watch and enjoy this presentation on the Book of Proverbs from the Bible Project.
The Book of Proverbs. The word proverb typically refers to a short, clever saying that offers some kind of wisdom, and this book has a lot of those. But they're almost all in the center section of the book, chapters 10 to 29. But there is way more going on in the Book of Proverbs, especially at the beginning, chapters 1 through 9, and the conclusion, chapters 30 and 31. The book's been designed with an introduction, chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, and it first of all links this book to King Solomon. Now remember the story in 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon had asked God for wisdom to lead Israel well. And so Solomon became known as the wisest man in the ancient world. And we're told in 1 Kings chapter 4 that he wrote thousands of proverbs and poems and collected knowledge about plants and animals. So Solomon was like the fountainhead of Israel's wisdom literature. So while not all the material in this book is written by him personally, he is where Israel's wisdom tradition began. The introduction says that by reading this book, you too can gain wisdom. Now, wisdom for most of us means knowledge, but the Hebrew word chokhmah means much more than just mental activity. It refers to action also. So think skill or applied knowledge. This is why back in the book of Exodus, chapter 31, it was artists and craftsmen in Israel who were said to have chokhmah. So the purpose of this book is to help you develop a set of practical skills for living well in God's world. And this gets linked with another key idea in the introduction, the fear of the Lord. Now, fear here is not about terror. It's about a healthy sense of reverence and awe for God and about my place in the universe. It's a moral mindset that recognizes I am not God and that I don't get to make up my own definitions of good and evil and right and wrong. Rather, I need to humble myself before God and embrace God's definition of right and wrong, even when that's inconvenient for me. Now, this introduction leads us into the first main section of the book, chapters 1 through 9, which also doesn't contain short one-liner proverbs. Rather, what we find here are 10 speeches from a father to a son about how the son should listen to wisdom and cultivate the fear of the Lord and live accordingly, which means a life of virtue and integrity and generosity, all of which lead to success and peace. And the father warns his son also about folly and evil and stupid decisions that will breed selfishness and pride, all leading to ruin and shame. And so the son should make the pursuit of wisdom and the fear of the Lord his highest goal in life. And this way of thinking, it forms the moral logic of this entire book. Now, these speeches from the father also clue us into what biblical wisdom literature is and how it's different from other parts of the Bible. These books explore how to live well in God's world, but wisdom is not the same as law, like what Moses gave Israel at Mount Sinai. And it's not the same as prophecy, divine speech to God's people. Rather, wisdom literature has the accumulated insight of God's people through the generations about how to live in a way that honors God and others. And so, through the book of Proverbs now, these human words about wisdom have been put together as God's word and wisdom to his people, which connects to the other thing you find in chapters 1 through 9. There are 4 poems from Lady Wisdom. Here, wisdom has been poetically personified as a woman who calls out to humanity to pay attention and to seek her. Wisdom says that she is woven into the fabric of the universe, and so wherever you see people making wise decisions, they are relying on her. So you see someone being generous or having sexual integrity or upholding justice. They are drawing on wisdom. These Lady Wisdom poems, they're a creative, poetic way of exploring this idea that we live in God's moral universe, and that goodness and justice are objective realities that we ignore to our own peril. And so fearing the Lord, living wisely, it's living along the grain of the universe. Now together, these 2 sets of speeches from the Father and Lady Wisdom, they make a powerful claim about this book, that you're not simply reading good advice, you're reading God's own invitation to learn wisdom from previous generations. And so in the next section of the book, chapters 10 through 29, we find hundreds of ancient proverbs, and they apply wisdom and the fear of the Lord to every life topic you could imagine: family, work, neighborhood, friendship, sex, marriage, money, anger, forgiveness, alcohol, debt, everything. And these are all filtered through the value system of Proverbs 1 through 9. Now, these Proverbs, they're all pretty short, they're easy to memorize, and actually this section of the book is meant to become a reference work that you return to time and time again throughout the years, which raises some important issues in learning how to read these Proverbs. First of all, Proverbs are by nature about probabilities. So you fear the Lord and you make wise, good choices, things will likely go well for you. And if you don't fear the Lord, you're foolish, your life will likely not go so well. Now, that is all often true, but not always. Which leads to the next point, that Proverbs are not promises. They're not formulas for success. So, some Proverbs, for example. The fear of the Lord prolongs your life, but the years of the wicked are cut short. Or, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't turn from it. So yes, fearing God, being a moral person, will most likely lead to a better, longer life, and raising your kids in a stable, loving home does set them up well, but there are no guarantees. Lots of things can and often do go wrong in our world. And so lastly, Proverbs by nature focus on the general rule, but not the exceptions, which are many. And the wisdom books actually aren't ignorant of that. The exceptions are what the other wisdom books, Job and Ecclesiastes, are all about. And together, these acknowledge that life is too complex for simple formulas, which is why we need all of the wisdom books together to get the bigger picture. This all leads to the final section of the book, two large collections of poems. First, poems from a man named Agur, who begins by acknowledging his own ignorance and folly and his great need for God's wisdom. And then Agur discovers that divine wisdom has been given to him in the scriptures, which teach him how to live well. And so Agur is put before us as like a model reader of the Book of Proverbs, somebody who's always open to hearing God's wisdom through the scriptures. The final poems are connected to a man named Lemuel. He's a non-Israelite king, and he passes on the wisdom that was given to him by his mom. It's guidance for being a wise and just leader. And then the final poem is an acrostic or an alphabet poem where each line begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And the entire poem's about the woman of noble character. It depicts a woman who lives according to the wisdom of Proverbs and stands like a model of someone who takes God's wisdom and then translates it into practical decisions in everyday life, at work or at home, in her family and in her community. So the book opened with words from a father to a son about listening to Lady Wisdom, and so now the book closes by offering the words of a mother to her son about a woman who lives wisely. The Book of Proverbs is for every person in every season of life. It's a guide for living wisely and well in God's good world, and that's what the Book of Proverbs is all about.